Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Free Word Foundation, I would like to welcome to this panel discussion on fake news. So we have just had a 2-day symposium together with the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, Vitenskapsakademiet. 2-day symposium on this same topic with lecturers from abroad and from Norway. So we are very happy that we can invite some of you here now to take up some of the topics from that symposium and discuss this theme both with reference to the Norwegian context and to the US, of course, and also to other countries, and with the perspectives of different backgrounds, different generations. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. Kjersti, vær så god.
Thank you very much. It's great to see that so many people have chosen to skip dinner and join the debate on the rise and fall of fake news. My hope is that we will spend much more time on the fall of fake news than the rise, but we're all academics, so it will probably be a lot on the problems anyway. My name is Kjersti Løken Stavrum. I am the CEO of the T-News Trust, that is the biggest shareholder of the media group Schibsted. We are also one of the founding mothers, I should say, of the Norwegian Faktisk.no. And since I used to be the Secretary General of the Norwegian Press Association, I'm very much interested in the trust of the media. But I will introduce you to this impressive panel, and I will start with our prominent guests from afar, from what I've called the kingdom of fake news, that is US. And I'll give to you then Michael Patrick Lynch, that is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut, where he directs the Humanities Institute. He's author or editor of several books, including the book The Internet of US. That is, of course, another internet than the others, I guess. Anyway, we also have George Marcus, that is Professor of Political Science at Williams College. He is educated from Columbia University, and his PhD is also from Northwestern University. His current research is on the role of emotions in democratic politics. And then we have Gunn Enli, that is Professor at Media Studies at the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Oslo. She teaches and does research in the fields of media policy, political communication, participatory media, and mediated authenticity. Authenticity is not a very difficult word to pronounce, I think. I heard you said that earlier today. Okay, but then we will start with the youngest in the audience, and that is Tuva Ahlsen. She lives and attends school in Fredrikstad. She's passionate about news, digital media, and is member of the advisory board of the Norwegian Safer Internet Centre. That is an organization under the Norwegian Media Authority, eller Medietilsynet in Norwegian. She is the national coordinator for the center's work on safer digital spaces for children and youth. And she's here to talk a little bit about her media diet. And she's of course also representative for all the young people that we all are very concerned about. So probably, or hopefully, she will comfort us. And then after Tuva, we will have a 5 minutes introduction from Per Søreide Senstad, who studies international relations and political theory at King's College in London. He's writing his dissertation on how technological disruptions can constitute a challenge to the legitimacy of liberal democracy as a form of government. I'm really looking forward to that. But anyway, Tuva, I will start with you and tell us a little bit about your concern, probably, on fake news or bullshit, as someone would call it, and propaganda. Is it on? Maybe not. You can push in the button there, I think.
Thank you. I forgot the question. Sorry.
Never mind. Tuva has not done this before, and all other speakers in panels, they never mind the question anyway. So you can just, you can just say whatever you want.
Fake news. It's, for me, a very new term, and probably for some of you too. I have never learned about it in school. I have never heard of it until Donald Trump. And many of my friends and fellow students don't have a lot of information about it, as we probably should have. But then again, it's not really, for me and my fellow students and friends, it's not really that big of a problem. Like I've stumbled upon some fake news from time to time when I was younger, but it was never something that I believed in. I understood that it wasn't real. And that's maybe because I've learned so much about source criticism in my school. The teachers were they thought it was very good for children to learn how to behave on the internet. So we learned a lot about that kind of stuff. So I feel pretty lucky that I know that, but I know it's a lot of other teenagers that don't really know that much about it.
Can I just follow up on, you said that, you think that you've seen fake news, but you immediately understood that it was fake. How is that?
I didn't know it was fake news right away, because, the article was about that the Third World War just started. And I was in 8th grade, and it was kind of right after the French mass shooting happened. So because I wasn't that old, and I thought it was real. But I looked up on my usual news media, and they hadn't posted anything about it. So I kind of understood then that it wasn't real by just checking other sources. Yeah.
But you're engaged in internet safety. Can you tell us or explain to us what is that?
Internet safety is being safe on the internet, basically. You kind of take this checklist, I call them checklists, where you kind of, if, for example, you think something is a fake news, you kind of check these checklists. If they have many checks that are like checked, it's probably fake news. Like if the title is very like, wow, big and fantastic, or very tragic, it's kind of like a more to the side of maybe fake news, and then you can, So it's just being safe on the internet.
So that is your contribution to the group that you're part of at the Media Authority?
I just say what teenagers do, and that's what I'm a professional at. I'm a teenager. That's all.
Oh, great! So tell us, what do teenagers do in general if they are confronted with news that probably is, or that can be true, or maybe not true? What do you think?
I don't really think teenagers read newspaper like papers. So they get all their news from social media, I think. That's what I do. And I think then they read maybe more like BuzzFeed and stuff that's not really considered newspapers. But I read NRK news on my Instagram. I follow them. So I get like daily news in, and that's very good. So I don't really read news from newspapers that I don't believe in, and those I don't trust, I don't read. So I think many teenagers do the same as me.
Just to clarify, will that say that Instagram is your sort of news feed, or was that just?
Yeah, it is. I follow all the normal Norwegian newspapers on Instagram, and it's very helpful because I don't think I would have like in my routine to read a newspaper in the morning. I don't have time. I need to get to school. So it's very good because I look at my phone all the time. That's just how it is. My life is my phone. So it's good to get it in like that because I know I will look at my phone. And I have like notifications, so I get like pling when when I get the news in from NRK. So yeah.
Okay. Per, I wonder if you would like to follow up or maybe make a leap from a youth perspective to a student's perspective on the digital challenges to the political society. Yeah. So, but I will give the microphone to you here.
Hello. An Australian professor of journalism and media studies named Brian McNair understands journalism as a process where information is extracted, processed, and refined from the infinite raw material that is what's happening in the world. McNair outlines how the journalist, through selecting what events and developments are worthy of news coverage, makes the world manageable. He or she enables the general public to make sense of and understand our social and political surroundings. Considering the degree of selection that is necessary, required to create this sense of order in a complex and ever-developing world, McNair argues that journalism is best understood as reflecting a mediated reality, a sampled version of reality that to some extent is created. The media content that makes up our sampled versions of reality is increasingly put together not by newspaper editors or television newsrooms, but by the logarithms that select the content which makes up our personalized social media content feeds. A 2016 survey from the Pew Research Center finds that 62% of Americans get their news primarily from social media. 9 out of 10 viewers of Dictionaries, the main news program here in Norway, are older than 40. In other words, young people are getting their news, this created reality, elsewhere. This development, where the social media newsfeed is increasingly used as a primary news source, is deeply problematic. The newsfeed is faceless and non-transparent. You cannot challenge the selection criteria of a Facebook logarithm in the same way as you can challenge the editorial processes in Dictionaries or in Aftenposten. Further, the commercial and political targeting of an ever more specific segment in the population, its unclear mix of sponsored and non-sponsored content, and the absence of human judgment regarding what is published and distributed makes our news feeds very vulnerable to manipulation. However, we cannot understand the rise of fake news, the significant and apparently growing influence of information pollution, ideological echo chambers, conspiracies and propaganda within our political communities solely as a result of the emergence of social media networks. Financial Times columnist Edward Luce argued that the increased consumption of fake news does not primarily reflect an increased supply of such content, but rather the reduced trust in established political institutions and practices throughout the liberal democratic world. As with drugs, the problem with fake news is not primarily the supply, it is the demand. The British author and activist. So, following this analysis, we must ask ourselves, why is it the trust in our established political world is declining? The British author and activist George Monbiot reminds us that humans are creatures of narratives. He writes that when we try to find sense of this complex world, what we look for is not primarily a consistent set of facts and figures, but a consistent grand narrative, a story, an analytical lens that helps us to make sense of everything that happens around us. I believe, and I hope that the panel can comment on whether the rise of the consumption of fake news might reflect that there is an absence of engaging and credible narratives regarding how our world operates and how our political communities should approach pressing contemporary policy challenges from the political center in most contemporary Western democracies. I believe that the rise of fake news is therefore not to a large extent reflecting not only a communication and information challenge, but a political crisis of ideas. How do we, for example, ensure social cohesion and civic identities in ever more culturally diverse populations? How do we avoid destroying the biosphere when our economic system inherently incentivizes growth in GDP, consumption and living standards? How should our national economies remain competitive in an ever more interconnected global marketplace without undermining the Northern European welfare state with its hard-won social safety net and labor standards? How should our domestic political communities, in our case Norway, navigate in an international environment where the United States no longer has the capacity or will to act as a global normative hegemon, a policeman of the world? The world is changing, and it is changing very fast. Fake news, particularly conspiracy theories and ideological echo chambers, offer narratives that make sense out of all of this. It is Arbeiderpartiet, it is the Jews, it is Hillary Clinton, it is George Soros that makes the world appear as unstable as it does. To counter fake news, we cannot therefore simply rely on fact-checking services' ability to reject the facts on which alternative worldviews are based. We must make efforts to offer an alternative, attractive story built on credible and viable policies that enable people to not only make sense of the world, but to be cautiously optimistic regarding the future.
Thank you very much for very interesting thoughts. And my luck is that I can just pass these thoughts and questions over to prominent speakers, for instance. Would you like to start? You spoke earlier on emotions and how they are sort of controlling our reactions. So what do you think? Is the true problem here not the fake news as such, but the problem is within the political system?
Let me begin by actually suggesting that first, fake news is neither new, and news about it is not new. So I was trying to think, what's the first event of fake news that I can recall? And I think it comes from Homer in the Iliad, when the Greeks, after many years of failing to defeat Troy, appear to get on their ships, but have left behind a large wooden sculpture of a horse, which the Trojans think is a gift to them as the Greeks sail off. And then over the night, out of the belly of the gift comes the best of the Greek warriors to then open the gates and destroy Troy. That's fake news. Somewhat later event, the first contested American presidential election, everyone knew that George Washington was going to be the president for as long as he wanted, having defeated the British, was Thomas Jefferson. And the first thing Thomas Jefferson did was hire a journalist to spread his stories, whereas the opponents hired their editors to tell their stories. So the manufacturing of stories to discredit, disclaim, that's a very old story. In the United States, tobacco companies were presenting smoking as safe and pleasant even when their own research told them it was producing cancer. So there's the whole commercial enterprise, which you mentioned, climate change and global warming and the like. So there's always been enterprises designed to mislead. That's nothing new. The Germans, when they decided to invade Poland, put some of their soldiers into Polish uniforms so they could present themselves as being attacked. So dissembling is a very old story. The kinds of issues of literacy are important, but here's something else you need to know. Most people never have heard about any particular conspiracy stories. The consumption of news is not something most people do. Of those that do get exposed to a story, the more sophisticated they are, they already have their views. That story isn't going to change them. So the principal purpose of conspiracy stories is to bolster the tribal community that already believes in whatever the key ethos is of those who are manufacturing that story. So I think it's less consequential. What is consequential is the distribution of that news stories is no longer a local affair, and it's no longer a national affair. It's an international affair, as all the stories about Russian efforts, but not just the Russians. The North Koreans do it, the Chinese do it, lots of people doing it, and indeed the US, through its AID program, has been promoting stories, some of which are true, some of which are disputable, for at least half a century, certainly since World War II. The cheapness of news and its consumption is the other big deal. Michael and I were talking how, when I was somewhat younger than I am now, a newspaper company would produce a morning news and then turn around in the evening, produce an evening newspaper. I doubt there's any company in the world that does that anymore. You get news, if you choose alerts as you do, within seconds of when someone hits the send button. So we deal with an overwhelming amount of news, which most of us deal with by siloing. I only want news from there and from there. I have no interest in news from here. So, what role do emotions play? They tell us what to pay attention to. In particular, the emotion of anxiety. It tells us to stop paying attention to whatever you're doing and pay attention to whatever just clicked on your phone or on the TV or whatever. But the other most important emotion is anger. Anger is a mobilizing emotion. You can see that in France in the Front National. You can see that in Germany, AfD. It's not fear, it's what mobilizes. It is anger that mobilizes. So the difference between those two emotions, in terms of its impact on audience, is the most important. So let me stop there, since I threw quite a bit out.
Well, okay. Michael, when you had your introduction today, you reminded us with the story on Pizzagate. That is, I guess, most here already know it, but very briefly, the guy that goes into this pizza store, because the story says that Hillary Clinton abuses children downstairs in the basement, a place that has no basement, by the way, and he has brought with him Gunn to just solve the situation, so to say. But just to follow up from Per then, is the problem then the Pizzagate story, or is the problem the hate against Hillary Clinton?
So, good question. Hold on a second. There you go. So, I think the short answer to that is the hate, anger, outrage is really what's going on. The Pizzagate story, I think, is interesting partly for our reactions to it. I think are almost more interesting than the fact that this 28-year-old man from North Carolina became convinced that there really was a child sex trafficking ring there. I mean, our reactions to it were particularly interesting. I think one of the things that really puzzled me about that is, about that whole phenomenon, is, and this is true about fake news in general, the conspiracy theories that are distributed, no matter, leaving aside how many people actually interact with them, are they believed? Well, they're believed by some people. Edgar Welch, the guy in the Pizzagate thing, he apparently believed it. But most people, think about it this way. If most people really believed that who read this story, really believed that there was a child sex trafficking ring in this well-known pizza restaurant in the middle of Washington, D.C., and that all their friends that they were sharing it with, they really thought that happened, then maybe, you might have expected, people to call the police, or, what did they do? Most people there were anonymous death threats that went on, and that's frightening. But that's sort of a weird way to respond to that, right, if you really believed it. More likely, the reaction was people shared it. They passed it on. And that indicates to me that really what's going on is more about outrage than actually some sort of absorption of what people consider to be factual information. I also just wanted to really quickly, I think the point that both of you made, the points that both of you made were excellent. And I think one of the things that we really do need to think about is media literacy. The idea of the checklist is a great idea. And frankly, I wish that many of my countrymen and women used a checklist, and if you had one, I'd distribute it right away on my Facebook feed. Maybe not the best way to get it across, but nonetheless, I think it's a great thing, and I could say more, but I'll leave it there.
Okay, and Gunn, today you spoke on how media is sort of constructing authenticity, and then probably introducing sort of blurred line between what is not completely true and what is absolutely fake and what could be true. So is it then is the problem, as you see it, I'm still trying to connect to Per's introduction, is the problem then within the media as you see it, or can it be that the core of the problem lies within a political dysfunctional system that is not really presenting to people stories and solutions that they really require?
Well, we can always criticize politics. And,
that's better than to criticize media, I think. That's where I'm heading. Yeah.
Well, I'm a media scholar, and I would say that I agree with most of what you said in your talk, and that the media do construct a reality. They do use techniques to select news and to frame news and to tell stories about what's going on in the world. This is not fake news, but it's not totally true neither. There's a kind of a contract between the audience and the producer that we accept that somewhat this news stories has to be adjusted to the format, to the radio format. For example, in the early days of radio, it was a news anchor. He said, well, today there are no news. And that was true because they didn't have anything to report. But imagine today someone sitting in front of a camera on Dictionaries saying, well, today nothing really happened. Well, they have to fill their amount of minutes with news stories, and they have to be in a certain time frame. It has to be people talking, etc. And of course, there are lots of things going on, events in the world, and some of these events end up as news, and some things are just left ignored. And in my field, we are interested in what stories are told and what are not told, and how are they told. And I think these things are important always, and it has always been important to discuss. Today, with the concept of fake news, this is, of course, the concept that relates to news being intentionally fake, false, not authentic at all, just based on lies. And And of course, the way Donald Trump talks about fake news is that he wants to delegitimize the established news media so that he can himself present his alternative news or whatever he wants to present via his Twitter and other sources. So the news is kind of it's an arena where we fight for what's real, our world views, and it's contested. So it's an important arena for negotiation of what is worth talking about, how should we talk about it, and of course, so the fake news topic here is extreme. I would argue, but this. It's also something that I wanted to mention is that there are the problem. If there is a real big problem, that's if everyone stops trusting the news media and everything is just more or less fake news, and that we think of it as not anything that we should care about. Even though, to your point about the Pizzagate and that people were only angry and emotional, this is actually also the case in real news, because we learn so much about the world that we cannot do anything about. We learn of wars, famines, crises, people who are hurting, and we feel that we should do something, but we know we can't really help them. So we become more or less numb about it, because we get so much information. And this is also why some people choose not to use the news media. So news avoiders, that's a concept we can talk about, the people who don't read the news or consult the news at all, and that could be because they are very sensitive, because they feel that, oh, this is so heavy, I should do something, and it's too much. Another reason why people don't use the news media could be that they are super busy and feel that they need to structure they couldn't have the phone as their lives, like being interrupted by notification. It makes it very hard to concentrate. So we need also to protect ourselves from the media sometimes. But also what we're talking about here today is mostly about distrust. And if people do not trust the media, that could be because they believe that it's not true. They believe that they are really faking the facts, but it could also be that they believe that it's not relevant. This is not relevant for me. This is not something that I feel relates to my world or my everyday life.
When it comes to nothing has happened lately. We in Norway are lucky because we always have something to report on Mannen, the mountain that never changes. Anyway, earlier today, you reminded us of the fact that in the 20s, there was this radio show that people misunderstood.
1938.
38, right. And that people misunderstood because they thought it was real, but it was, it was a radio show. Is that sort of the parallel to these days when we are about to be literate on the fact that there are lots of things here that looks like news, but they are not? So could you reflect a bit on maybe we're just, this is a phase we're going through?
Yes, in a way we see that every new medium, every new media technology, when it's introduced, it causes a lot of turbulence and debate and hopes, fears. We think maybe that the new media will save us, make it more democratic, make the world better. But we are also having fears. Will we be destroyed by radio? Will we be destroyed by television? And now the internet. Will it be harmful? Will it make society worse and harm democracy? So referring to the episode of The War of the Worlds in 1938, when Orson Welles used radio news bulletins as if they were real in a fictional drama series, and a large proportion of the audience, listeners, they thought it was real, and this was of course a big scandal, and it has become a myth. of how masses can be manipulated through mass media. Of course, this was the early days of radio and early days of television. We had similar scandals, and now we are at maybe early stage of social media, internet, new technologies for distributing and producing news. So we are also now negotiating this, and it also has to do with regulation on the political level. How can we regulate this? How should Facebook and Google be regulated? Should they themselves regulate their algorithms, or should they ban fake news sites at their platforms, etc.? So we are now talking about how to solve these problems, and to what degree is this really something that we can handle through regulation.
I think that is a very interesting question. I would like to ask you, Tuva, because we always talk about Norway then as a country where we have a huge amount of trust in the government, trust in the institutions. And you yourself is part of Medietilsynets work for safer internet. Do you think that for instance the government will remove fake news or stories in your Instagram feed that would be harmful in a way? Do you think that they could just fix things here?
No.
No?
I think it's because it's such a big, it's on the internet, it's out there. And it's such a big thing from the States, where a lot of these news come from. And I don't think, maybe they can do something. I don't really know actually. But I feel like they won't have the options to do that and take it away from my Instagram feed. But they can probably do it in the Norwegian newspapers.
You think so?
Yeah, but not from my Instagram feed.
Well, they cannot. But anyway, Michael was talking a little bit on how to put it, that the news maybe are meant to be liked, and that they probably need to be shaped to your Instagram feed. Is it so that when you place this heart on NRK that is in your Instagram feed, do you place a heart on those stories that Gunn, for instance, says that you get frustrated on for not being able to do something with, or is it only likable stories there?
No, I usually don't like, because if it's a sad story, it doesn't really fit in with liking it. Because I know some people do it because they want to like show their respect and send their loves, kind of. But I don't really. I choose to not like it, but I read them. I think that's more important than showing that you like it.
Okay. But what will happen with your feed and the algorithms over time then, if you don't like them? Then they will disappear?
They disappear, but I look them up all the time.
Okay.
And I get the notifications, as I said, because they disappear because I don't like them. But when I have the notifications on, they always come up as when I turn my phone up. So.
But Pek, if we track this likable thing from the media that is sort of adjusting to, I mean, most news organizations know how to adjust their stories so that they can be likable and go viral. But won't also the political system adjust to that? I mean, if it's so that you are asking for their stories to people, don't you think that they will just start making those stories and be part of this society that is constructed to be liked?
Policies that are constructed with the sole purpose of being liked is often made reference to as populism. So I believe we must regain some faith in ourselves and our community as citizens, that we actually are able to engage, even in a digital age, in political discourse, not only on the premises of likable content. And I believe that if we lose that faith, the dynamics of the like of populism will reinforce themselves, because the lack of faith can become ever-growing. And it was quite interesting during the seminar that took place yesterday and today, where there was a variety of academics from Norway and the US. And I hope I do not insult someone here, but there was...
Please do. Then we get some energy here, yeah.
there was quite a conceptual difference between how most of the Norwegian academics appeared to understand the public sphere and the role of knowledge production within that public sphere, and how some of the American academics tended to understand the role of knowledge production. Because some of the speakers, of the US speakers, appeared to have kind of rejected many of the assumptions regarding human nature that liberal democracy is founded upon, that there is possible to have an informed political discourse and debate, and that the role of the academic is that of a political activist, to never acknowledge a point of your opponent, to always provide arguments to the political side you sympathize with. And I think when the people that represent political institutions and academia subscribe to this worldview and the understanding of the political domain only as a battleground, then we have given up on democracy and on the idea of informed exchange of opinions. So that was the difference.
Okay, yeah, please.
So, as one of those American academics,
they are, of course,
I
not
might,
represented in the panel.
So I think, you know, so speaking for myself, I think you're right that there is a huge, and I spent a lot of time worrying and writing about this, exactly this point, that if we become too cynical about what I call the sort of seeing democracy as a space of reasons, if we stop seeing it as even in the ideal as a space of reasons, but instead see politics as war by other means, then yeah, the game is over. So we can't stop having faith in those ideals. On the other hand, I think we're at a moment right now where it's also important to be woke, as we say in the U.S., to be aware that actually likability is what politics happens to be. It may, to some extent, you might say it's always been that way since, you know, Homer. And you know, I mean, it's been human beings. They've been trying to impress each other through appealing to each other's strongest feelings, like outrage. So that's all true. But at this moment, right now, we have, in my country, we have a president who is an expert. Whatever else, he's not, you know, I don't think he's an expert in anything else, but he's an expert at generating outrage and using whatever content comes out of his mouth to, I'm not sure he ever knows what it's going to be from moment to moment, but using that content to generate the sort of the emotions that lead to viral sharing, whether it's on the internet or in the old-fashioned way. I mean, think about it this way. I mean, you touched on, I mean, look, in a very brief amount of time, the term, at least in the United States, the term fake news has now become synonymous not with, you know, people in the United States don't use it to mean deliberate lies. What they use it for is synonymous with some news story I don't like. That's what the term fake news means now. And that has been very much partly a product of the expertise that I was just talking about. And that's I think if you see in me, and obviously I'm allowing my full cynicism now to come out, So to me, I think in order to regain the hope and ideals, at least in my country right now, we need to be able to also recognize that we're in a dark, dark place.
But just a little bit comment on the term itself, because I absolutely agree with you that because the most powerful man in the world uses the term in that way, not likable news, then we probably should stop using fake news, because anyone that tries to provide an alternative definition has an uphill battle.
Yeah. So the term I prefer is information pollution.
Right.
Sadly, not quite as maybe as
it's not
viral.
It's not viral, no.
Yeah, it's not, so hey, philosopher. But I like the term information pollution because it also first of all, it allows us to talk about a variety of ways in which the information culture can be polluted through propaganda, through tweeting, through what we used to call fake news, deliberate lies. It also, I think, when we think about information pollution, you got to understand that there are fake news doesn't assign any agency. And a lot of times with information pollution, right now, there's agency. There's somebody out there polluting the environment. And it might be being done by a person, or it might be being done by a troll farm, a set of people, or it might be done by an algorithm. I think the other nice thing about information pollution is when you think about it as pollution, regulation now becomes something that you can talk about. Right? It becomes at least on the table as a solution.
George, I need to pass it on to you as well, because the challenge from Per here is that there are, in his opinion then, two different contexts of this debate on fake news, and that the Americans that are not present in the panel, but maybe, I don't know, unnamed Americans, discuss this phenomenon from your perspective, and when it comes to anger, then, so probably is it so then that the anger that has probably provided the White House to Donald Trump, it's maybe you should sort out the anger before you can do something with fake news.
Well,
the microphone, I think, or the yeah.
So. First on Donald Trump in the White House. First, in one sense, he didn't win the White House. Hillary Clinton got close to 3 million more votes than he did. That's a peculiarity of the way votes are counted in the United States. Most of you probably know that, and it's kind of boring to go through it all. Second, had then head of the FBI, Comey, not released yet another letter on the release of the question of Hillary Clinton's emails, plus a few other things I can mention. So he was more gifted than won the White House. Much in the same way, by the way, that Hitler got to be prime minister. He didn't win elections to get to be prime minister. It was the German capitalist who spoke to Hindenburg and said, that's our guy, he'll straighten things out and we can control him. So in that respect, I have much more confidence in public collective judgment than I suspect my earlier remarks might have suggested. So what I'm concerned about is the following point about democracy. All of us make decisions, who to vote for, who to try to get elected, who to give money to or knock on doors for, on the expectation that good things will happen. We have no way whether they will or will not. So let me tell you two historical anecdotes. One, once I tell you the basics of it, you'll say, well, we know how that's going to turn out, and you'll be wrong. And the other one, you'll say, I know how that's going to work out, and you'll be right. And then you have to figure out which of those they are. Okay, so the first one is a project called the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study. It was done in 1936 by a group of scholars, basically at Harvard, who said, we can do something to make the lives of boys no longer with their families being raised by the state better. But we want to be scientific about this. So they selected roughly about between 500 and 600 and divided them into two groups. One they left as what in science we'd call the control group, and then the treatment group, those students or young adolescents were given advisors, they were sent to summer camps, they were given a lot of interventions so they would have a much better start on life. So that's one. The second one will tell you which one worked out well and which one worked out badly. So in the turn of the century, progressives in the United States said the best scientific research tells us we can improve the human condition. Once I tell you the method, you'll understand how that turned out. And indeed, they persuaded many state governments and indeed the U.S. Supreme Court to accept what they proposed. And that was sterilization, primarily of women, but also of men, to prevent them from having children because they were found to be mentally deficient. That's the eugenics program. And many of Hitler himself copied that from the Americans. So one lesson is good intentions don't necessarily lead to good results. So I don't care whether people are lying to me or not, because I've learned to distrust people who believe what they're telling me. What's more concerned is what the results. So what happened with the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study? What do you expect happened? All the children who got this special treatment would have had much better lives. Well, 40 years later, they tracked them all down through public records, and they did not. They were more likely to commit a serious crime. They were more likely to reoffend. They were more likely to have mental problems and be dealt with at that time in the United States, might end up in a mental institution. Those were special hospitals where people could be incarcerated. No one knows quite why. And the reason why we're puzzled by it, because of course we think giving people loving intervention should produce a better result. And we know that they did get better care, the best care that was available to give to young children at the time. So what does that mean? I don't care whether someone is manufacturing a story. All stories are manufactured. That's in one sense what you said about the media. We have to make this presentable. We want it exciting, interesting, engaging. That's going to be true. Nor do I care about the intentionality of the people. The job of the media is to probe and say, has this ever been tried before? What happened when it was done in another place or in another time? Is there any evidence? And that's the critical feature here. Is there any evidence to make this plausible? And if we find unexpectedly it doesn't work, can we get out of it really quick at the lowest cost? And to me, that's the role of the journalist, and very little beyond that. So is that?
Okay, yeah. I think I'll go back to Michael's point, that because you said that this is the point where we can talk about regulations. Mm. But Gunn, you earlier today in your presentation said that when it comes to the development in this sphere, the regulations has a vaguer and vaguer role to play. That we were more trusting and eager to have the control, after the Orson Welles show.
Yes, of course, it's easier to regulate media on a national level than international global companies, and also the problem is that Google and Facebook and Netflix, they don't want to be defined as media companies. They want to be tech companies and therefore not included in regulatory regimes. And also in Norway, the government have tried to invite some of these actors to talk, which is a very normal, common ways of doing the policies here in Norway. But these companies, they don't even show at the at the meeting. They ignore the requests from Norwegian authorities. So this is very uncommon from what we are used to, because the established media companies with traditions in Norway, they always meet with the authorities and discuss, and then that's how regulations are made in corporations. So if there are no dialogues, then it's difficult. So the first step is to get dialogues, and then to get on an international level of regulating these things.
But Per, do you believe? Is regulation the way to move forward here, or how do you think that we should combat fake news or information pollution? That is actually what we're talking about.
I do not have very specific thoughts on media regulation. That's not my field at all. But building on your insights to some extent, I believe that we cannot, even though kind of the contemporary political challenge is to know that something is not completely true or scientifically proven. We have moved past many of these ideals that our political system is built upon. We know that human nature is not as it is outlined during the Enlightenment. We are not primarily rational creatures. Decision-making processes are primarily emotional, for example. And we have decades of research of how a variety of power structures define what knowledge is produced, in the way making it very easy to be convinced that all knowledge is relative and that politics is only a battleground. But if you lose the kind of application of those Enlightenment ideals, and if you stop creating a political language and addressing the political sphere with the language of hope and aspiration and kind of aspiring to be more than we actually are, then our political domains become a very nihilistic place. And I think that is what we see in a variety of liberal democratic countries. And something very interesting in France with the new President Macron is not his policies, which in many ways are very centrist and very conventional in many ways from a Norwegian or Scandinavian point of view. But what is really interesting, he is openly talking about his rhetorical vision and his stated goal of bringing political rhetoric back into the French political domain, which has become almost clinically free from kind of the language of hope or the language of communality. So the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and the political community we find ourselves in, these two things exist in symbiosis. And even though we know we are not rational, we know that we as political communities face challenges probably unsolvable. We must still strive to be optimistic and strive to address our common citizens as if we are a bit more rational than we actually are. Because if not, then we must turn into technocracies, because then liberal democracy as a form of government appears to not be an efficient way to organize society.
Michael, I will ask you about insecurity, but I will also just ask you that are listening if any of you have questions.